Hi, everybody. You might need a little bit of help in kind of some of the planning portion of your project, especially in figuring out like what needs to be built and creating a backlog. Now, a backlog, many of you who've taken my production class already know what a backlog is. And those of you who don't, backlogs are used in just about any project, especially team-based projects, not just video games, even though we do use them in the video game industry all the time, all sorts of experience-based projects or anything with project management where there are a lot of people and a lot of pieces. And it's something that helps you kind of organize your project. It helps you prioritize things, and it helps you kind of create a list of what you need to know. So I'm going to show you some stuff about backlogs. I'm going to show you about how to break your project down into the features and components. We're doing this really quickly. I'm going to try to do this in one take, so please excuse any, I don't know why there's a poll thing in the background. I'm going to delete that right now. So we're going to try to do this in one take. And please message me on Discord if you have any questions. Doesn't matter what team you're on. If you have any questions about this, feel free to message me or just tag me on Discord, and I'll be more than happy to answer any questions that you have. So, but like I said, I'm going to be using video games as an example, but this can be used for anything. It can be used for an escape room. It can be used for an animation project. It can be used for an installation. It can be used for a website, an app. It can be used for a stage production. There's all sorts of things that this can be used for. So just in your individual projects that you do in your everyday life. As a matter of fact, I sometimes create backlogs for organizing my classes. I sometimes, if I'm doing a big project at home, I'll create a backlog because it just helps you kind of think through the project, think through what you're creating and breaking it down into smaller pieces and then prioritizing those pieces and figuring out like what actually needs to be created. So here we go. So we're talking about from planning to production. Let me move myself over to the corner here. And when we talk about this, we're talking about first, like you need to identify your features. Now that isn't the easiest thing to do. You might have an idea of what you want to create and it exists in your head. And you might write out a lot of details, but it's really, really hard to know every feature that you need to create. So you might sit down with your team and figure those things out. But a really good way that I recommend doing it is to write out like longhand, not in bullet points, but longhand, the first 5 to 10 minutes of the experience. This is a very, very common practice in all the industries in AET, because what you're doing is you're actually sitting down and thinking, what is the user experiencing from moment to moment for a full 5 or 10 minutes? Usually 5 or 10 minutes encompasses the totality of an experience in your games or well in your project. And it helps you kind of think through all those elements that need to be created in order to develop those 5 minutes or 10 minutes. Sometimes I've recommended to some folks that they do 10 minutes. But if you're making a puzzle game with a battling system, you're probably going to have battles in there. You're probably going to have the puzzle components. And it really makes you sit down and think through all of those different things. Now, there are a couple different ways of doing it. Now, this is from the SAW game design document, but most professional game design documents, full game design documents, not the briefs that we're asking you to do. These almost always have a description of the first 5 minutes of gameplay, or just 5 minutes of gameplay, or 10 minutes, because it really helps the team kind of digest their ideas and think through like, hey, what's it take to make up this material that we're creating? So a good example would, so in this, you really have to think it through. I apologize once again, trying to do it in one take. So there are a couple different ways of doing this. Now, you've all sat with your teams, you've all figured out what you think your game is going to be, but are you on the same page? Are you in alignment? Well, you could have every single person on your team write down what they think 5 minutes of gameplay is, or 5 minutes of the experience. I apologize. I keep saying gameplay because my brain is about games. When I say gameplay, I mean your experience. So, so having each individual team member write out 5 minutes, the same 5 minutes of the experience without talking to each other about it, go, all right, we're going to describe the first 5 minutes, or we're going to write out the 5 minutes of a mission, or we're going to write out 5 minutes of a battle, and have everyone write it out themselves separately and then come together, look at those comparisons, see where you might not be in alignment on your ideas. or you can get together as a team, have one person type it, but you're all contributing together. Once again, this is not a bullet pointed list of what happens in the first 5 minutes, because then you're not thinking through all the fine details of what happens moment to moment of the experience. The whole point of the 5 minutes is you're thinking about moment to moment experiences. Okay, now you've got your 5 minutes done. Now you need to go through it and go, okay, so what's it take to create this experience? What components do we need? What features do we need? What elements do we need? What art do we need? What design do we need? All these different things. So this is where you're starting with your backlog, but let's talk about those features. So those features are what help you identify what your project is, and it's about breaking down into outlining abstracts, because you don't know all the details. That's why you write the first 5 minutes, because you haven't actually built it yet. And part of the building experience is experimenting and trying different things. So that 5 minutes is going to change as you develop your game. Sorry, as you develop your experience. However, you need to start somewhere. So you're starting with abstract ideas. But as you go through the journey of creating a backlog, and then once you get through pre-production, those abstracts are going to become very, very clear, and you need to identify what value they provide. So, all right, so let's get going. So when I talk about features, there's a term we use in the games industry, but a lot of other industries also use this, especially when it comes to software development. And we call them epics. So epics, think about the Iliad, right? The Iliad is this big epic story. So we call it epics, but what we really mean is an epic is a feature level component of work. So, but it's an abstract when you haven't worked out all the details, because you still don't know all the details of your features or your epics. When you're in pre-production, you're not going to really know those features until you're actually in production and you can work out all the details, because you're experimenting, you're trying kind of we talked about in Foundations of Games, we call it forward design, where you, in all the projects everyone worked on, I gave them a kit and I asked everyone to experiment with it before they started designing their levels. And that's called forward design. That's when you're experimenting with things, trying things out, and having those things kind of through that discovery talk to you and start designing that experience with you. And so these are large, very big categories of work. And so here's an example. And I'm going to use game examples here, but once again, this can work for anything. An example I'm going to use is an epic, could be inventory. Now, I don't know exactly what, I know I'm making a game. I know I want it to have an inventory system, but I don't know all those details yet, right? But I'm just going to call it inventory because I know it needs to be created. I'm writing in my first 5 minutes that the mage goes into their inventory system, crafts a spell in the inventory system, recalls it, pulls it out, and uses it, right? Okay, so of course, in my first 5 minutes, it'll be a lot more detailed than that, but I now know I need to have an inventory system, right? And so I'll put an epic description that basically the description. Okay, I had a little bit of a problem there. My computer crashed while I was in the middle of recording, so I'm going to continue where I left off. We have an epic example, which is an inventory system, right? A lot of games have inventory systems, so it's not that unusual. And I've already described in the previous video that you saw, or the previous portion of this video that you just saw, what an inventory system could be. But we don't really know all the details of our inventory system yet. So for our description of it, we're just going to say how the player manages items collected. Okay, well, then as we go through the journey, so this is what we want for this point. This is what we want you to figure out at this point, because we're not asking you to create time estimates. We're not asking you to do anything. We just want to know like what features you're creating. And we want you to prioritize them. So where would that inventory system be in your priority? You're adding it to your backlog. We'll talk about backlogs in just a second. So, but once you're getting closer to actually developing that inventory system, you want to clarify what that is. So an epic, after the feature of an inventory system, or that epic of the inventory system, once you have a better idea of it, you would refer to it as something like an inventory system showing the numbers of all items, spells, and ingredients that have been accumulated, the contents of which can be organized and activated by the player as needed. So these now become stories, right? Because what you're now doing is you're providing clarity for it, but it's also getting a lot more detail. So the reason we call these epics and stories is an epic is like a big giant book that's filled with stories. Epics are a big novel, a big story that's filled with little stories, right? So the epic is the overarching thing, and the stories are the things that you use to build that epic. And so this is a feature. So now those features need to be broken down into the smaller details. Now you're not going into the smaller details right now because we're in pre-production. You're too far away from building it. But once you get to building it, we now have things in this inventory system that we need to actually create. Now the stories of an inventory system would not be spells and items, because you're probably going to have your own epic for spells, because spells can do different things. They don't exist just in the inventory system. But what does just exist in the inventory system? Well, here's some examples. Like a story is like a 1 or 2 line description of a content or tool that is part of the epic. And you want to use it as kind of placeholder describing what it does, how it functions, and how that leads to completion criteria. So an epic for your inventory system could be the user interface. But once you get into the description, you could say user interface that allows players to move things around. And what is that user interface that's actually within that inventory system itself? You have UI in all different aspects of your experience that you're creating, well, especially if you're creating a game. So what's the unique elements of the inventory system for the user interface? Collecting things, that is like you have to have collections within an inventory system. You might want to categorize those. You might want to have them where you're only calling up specific collections within the inventory system. You might want to have your crafting happen within your inventory system, or at least elements have been combined. Have you ever played a game where you're like taking a leaf that you found and taking some other ingredient, you combine them together and now they become mana or something like that? Like this is kind of something that would happen specifically in the inventory system. It's something that is part of the inventory system. It needs to be built. So it's a story for your inventory system. Activating things, you have to activate things in an inventory system so you can use them, right? And so switching things out, activating them, removing them, adding things, these are all part of an inventory system. So these all become the stories of the inventory system. You could have timing. You might have things that you activate in the inventory system, but they're only working for a specific period of time. And you look in the inventory system, you can watch that clock go down. Like these are all those elements that break it up. Notice these are not tasks. So for instance, you're not talking about creating the artwork. You're not talking about creating the code. You're not talking about creating those little elements. Those are tasks. So your epics are your big feature level components of work. That's what we're asking for right now. Stories are the components of that epic that you need to have in order to build that epic. The tasks are all the individual things you need in order to make those stories. Okay, so now let's talk about backlogs. So backlogs are basically all projects have backlogs. Like even if you're building a house, you need to have a backlog because you need to know what needs to be built in what order and what your priorities are. So it's everything involved in making your project in order of priority that you know at the time that you are figuring it out. Your things are going to change as you go through production, as you develop. They're not going to always be the same thing. So you need to figure these things out early, but you don't want to figure out all the details, because if you pre-plan everything, you're basically not going to have the opportunities to discover and rework and iterate. And iteration is a big part of design. And it's a big part of building these experiences and making them engaging and feel right. So the epics and stories live in the backlog, and the backlog is a way of prioritizing, organizing, and scoping your project. So here's an example of a backlog. It could be done in an Excel spreadsheet. It could be done on a document. It could be done anywhere, but there's a tool I'm going to suggest to you that you can use, but a lot of companies just start with Excel spreadsheets but it's something you want to be able to edit because you're always going to be changing it, always going to be updating it, and always going to be adding to it. So as soon as you have your epics, you can start building your backlog. So break those, or your features, right? So break your project down into features or epics, same thing, and then prioritize them. But and you can add stories once you define what those stories are, and then you can kind of put them under the epics as kind of a category. So let's talk about like how you like create a backlog, right? So I'm going to pause this for just a second because I'm going to switch over to another tool that I want to share with you on how you actually kind of put a backlog together. We're going to put one together right now. Okay, so what we're going to do is I'm going to take now, once again, this isn't limited to games. I'm going to repeatedly say that because everyone hears me talk about games and I think that's the only way we can do these things. But no, these are done for all sorts of projects. So the first thing we're going to do is I'm going to make a backlog using a game called Galaga, right? This is my favorite game, and it's a real simple, basic game, but it has a lot of elements to it, and you really need to think through. Now, I'm not going to write the first 5 minutes of gameplay because we just don't have time for it, but hey, look, it's a game that already exists. I can show you the first 5 minutes. I'm not even going to play the first 5 minutes because we don't have time for that, but I kind of want to give you a flavor of it. So right now, we're just seeing the menu of Galaga, right? Let me press play here, and we can listen to it, hear the sound effects, see the experience for a minute or two. Oh, there we go. Worried we didn't have music. So we see we have a user interface, we have a scoring system, we have the ships, we have different types of enemies, we have the ships getting destroyed, we have the missiles, we have the 1-up at the time because that builds up a timer, and we have sound effects. I think I've already mentioned that. We have the flying mechanics. We have all sorts of different things. We have multiple ships. So these are all the elements that we have of Galaga. And we have the scrolling background. Look at the scrolling background there. Like all these little details are things that we need to have. So let's create a backlog on, multiple stages, right? We need multiple stages. Let's now create our backlog. So the tool I'm going to recommend that you use to create a backlog is called Trello. You can do it in Excel. You can do it in all sorts of different tools as long as it can be edited. I recommend you don't put it in a Word doc or something like that because it's hard to organize things and move things around in a Word doc. But Trello is this amazing tool. It's free, and you can create these Trello boards. Now, they call them Trello boards, but they're actually called Kanban boards. Kanban boards come actually from Japanese auto manufacturing. It was invented by Toyota. And basically it is columns of things that need to be done in the order that they need to be done in, going through a production pipeline. And so it's a list of tasks, and that ends up being their backlog, and you can grab it and take it through each stage. So we're going to create a backlog right now. So the first one is I'm going to write backlog right here. And this is a list of everything that needs to be done for the game or the project that you're doing. And I'm going to make a column called concepting. We could also call it prep or pre-production. I'm going to add in development, right? Let me add it right now. In development, add the list. I'm going to add review. Maybe it needs to be reviewed by the person who's the point person on it, like the art director, the tech director, the design director. And then we'll do testing, right? We'll add testing because we need to play test it, right? Maybe we need to play test it before we do the review. So here, let me move it actually to before the review. And let me add one more card let me add one more and we'll call it complete. Right now, this is a Kanban board, right? This is not a backlog. Only this part is the backlog, okay? Only this part, because you only want one backlog, and that's for everything. So let's talk about Galaga. So what are the things that we saw in Galaga, right? We saw the player ship, right? Okay, that's our feature. That's our epic, all right? But then we had enemy ships, right? Enemy ships. Right? So I'm not listing out every single enemy ship because every single enemy ship would be a story, not an epic, right? Okay, so what else do we have? We have background or environment, right? So we're going to have that. We're going to have missiles or weapons. I've got to spell missiles correctly. I've still misspelled missiles. There we go. And we add that card. We need, what else do we need? We need music, right? We need sound effects. Now, these are big epic pieces. These are feature level pieces. So I'm not going into a lot of detail on these. I'll show you what happens when we get to the details. Now, what's next? We have enemy ships. Okay, we have the user interface, right? The user interface, menus can be part of user interface. So you have different modes. So each mode of the user interface, so we have the user interface of the HUD, right? But we also have the menu system, right? So how's it giving that feedback and things like that to the player? So we'll just stop here for now because this is a good section of a backlog, right? Now, now I'm going to go now, wait, now I need to prioritize these things, right? Now I need to know what's the highest priority and what's the least priority, because the whole idea of this is that you're organizing things in the most critical to the least critical. What do you not have an experience without? So let's take a look back at the presentation I was showing you here. And in prioritizing a backlog, what you want to do is you want to prioritize it. This is just a best practice. There, you can do it however you and your team decide to do it, but you want to kind of focus, like the way we traditionally do it in the industry is we focus on what is the development cost, which is how much effort does it take? How much risk is it? Do we not, and when I say risk, I mean those knowns and unknowns. If you don't know how to do it, you're taking a risk. You're taking a risk that you might not be able to complete it in time. You might not be able to figure it out, or you're taking a lot more time to make it than you would be able to make something that you do know how to make, right? So how complicated is it to make it? Because you might know how to make something, but it's super complicated to make it. So these are the kind of development costs. What is the user value? How much does this add for the user experience, right? Users kind of, you're making a game, you're making your experience, you're making your project for a user. So you need to always think about that user and what will they be getting out of it, right? And then of course, the business value. If you're making this for a business, your business is getting a good project and a good grade. Really, if you just focus on development costs and user value, you should be good. But if you're thinking about the business value, you're trying to make a game with microtransactions, if you're trying to make a game that's a subscription-based service or a games or service, once again, I keep saying games, I mean projects. What is that business value? You combine those three elements, you should really only focus on two, the development cost and user value. That is where those things, that will help you figure out what is the highest priority versus what is the lowest priority. So we'll get back to that. But another thing I want to say is you should only have one backlog, okay? There should only be one project backlog, and it's constantly being added to. It's constantly maintained, reprioritized, and groomed, and it should be for your full project. So don't keep the information in multiple locations, keep them all together. Backlogs are not the place that you put bugs that need to be fixed or little art corrections or things like that. They are where your epics and stories live for your project. And then backlogs are iterative. What I mean by iterative, you're constantly adding to, adjusting, moving things along. And when I say that, you want to figure out how, because you're going to be adding things to your backlog throughout your entire development of your project. You'll always be adding to them. Some project backlogs never end, because if you're doing a games as a service or an MMO, you're always going to be adding to that backlog. But in this case, you are going to have a finite ending, but you still want an opportunity to add things to the backlog, because you are going to find that there are things that you didn't know about your project early on, and you're going to discover it later, and you now want to add those things to the backlog. So when you add items, there's two kind of polar opposites that you can have, two extremes that you could have. It could be a free-for-all, where any member of the team can add anything to the backlog at any time. And the other extreme is you have one person who's tasked at adding things to the backlog. That could be a producer, project manager, just whoever's like tasked to do it and manage the backlog. Now, the problem with having everyone add the bad things as a backlog as a free-for-all is that it makes it, it can be overwhelming. It can be very cumbersome. Things are being added without the team discussing it. It can become a very sloppy mess very quickly. And then you're spending more time maintaining the backlog than you are actually doing any work. The other extreme is you're having a gatekeeper who's they're deciding what gets added to the backlog or not. That's extreme too, when you only have one person adding things to the backlog. So you want to avoid gatekeeping, but you also want to avoid having a big free-for-all. So it's a team discussion. Maybe have a backlog meeting every once in a while with your team and say, okay, what do we need to add to the backlog? What do we need to change? So I already talked about this. So you want to kind of just define a standard amongst your team on what works best for your backlog. And then you want to have a backlog grooming. Every once in a while, look at the backlog as a team and decide, okay, what's old? What are we getting rid of? What has changed in priorities? What was kind of new that we added, that or what did we think was a really high priority, but we found as we go on this journey, we're either going to cut that feature or it's not as high a priority. But I would have these meetings regularly. Now I'm going to switch back here to our Trello board, because now I'm going to talk to you about putting into action with stories. Let me just pause the recording here for one moment. Okay, so we're back in our Trello board. I am going to change the name of this backlog to, um, let me see, how do I rename these things? Oh, here we go. So I'm going to call this project backlog. And now I'm going to add another card here. I'm going to go all the way to the end here. I'm going to add another card. I'm going to call Sprint One Planning. Okay, so let me add that. I'm going to take it all the way over here because you're going to be doing your sprint. Every 2 weeks, you'll be having a new sprint. And in that, you're going to be taking your highest priority item from your backlog. Now, here's the thing. We have now player ships, right? So that's our epic. Now we're going to go to more detail and things like that. So we have only one player ship. That's fine. That can be its standalone only thing. But then we have enemy ships. And like when we looked over at Galaga a second ago, there's like all sorts of enemy ships in this game. Like, look at all those enemy ships. So we need to figure out, don't like try to make all of your enemy ships or all of one thing in a single sprint, because then or you're not going to get all the ones done. And then you go, oh wait, we needed 5 different enemies, we only got 2 done. Now let's just bleed it over into the next sprint. That means you have to cut something else in order to create all these enemies. Or you can scope your enemies, go, hey, we only got 2 enemies made. Let's now deprioritize that, and we'll make 3 more later if we have time. But don't try to make all your enemies in a single sprint, or try to spend all your time like, oops, sorry, I had the wrong one open here. Try to spend all your time making all your enemies up front, because then you're going to run out of time for everything else, right? So in our backlog, let's prioritize these, okay? Player ship, super critical. You don't have a game without it. Enemy ships, super critical. You don't have a game without it. Background environment. Do you still have a game without it? Yes, you do. I'm going to lower that priority. I'm going to look at the cost. Yes, it adds a nice visual value for the user. Yes, it's simple and easy to make, but you still have a game without it. So let's put it at the bottom here. Missiles and weapons. Yes, you don't have a game without it. Sound effects. You really need that for that experience. Music. I love the music in Galaga. It's very important, but you know what? It's a lower priority because you still have a game, you still have an experience without it. Now, if you have a sound-based experience, music is going to be way higher than it is in Galaga, right? User interface is important because how does the user know what their score is? How does the user know how many people they have, little ships they have left? All those different things. So in your sprint planning meeting, you are going to take the highest priority item. That's your player ship. Now, it might be a good idea to actually call these epics, right? So your epic, this is the ship that the player controls. So it can fire missiles. It can move. See, I don't know how to spell missiles. I don't know why. It can move left to right. And players get 3 total ships per game, right? I'm just summarizing this. So that's my description of my epic, right? Well, that's my epic. Now, whoa, we got to add stories. Stories are how we're going to figure out what needs to be made. So we go ship. So we have the ship itself, right? We have the ship itself. We have the shooter function. We have movement. We have multiple ships. So we have 3 ships, right? All that I got from that description, right? So the ship itself, that involves art, that involves design, that involves functionality, that involves code, that even involves sound effects, like if your ship has a unique sound or something like that. So now these are all our stories for our epic, and this is what we're going to spend our sprint actually building. So we're going to do, all right, so I'm going to actually, so let's change ship. So we're going to change this to ship sprite. Okay, we're going to change that to ship sprite. Okay, we conceive it, we do the concept art. Okay, now it's going over to modeling. Now it's in development. Now we're actually building it. See, these tasks go one to the other, and you can add people to it. So I'm going to add myself to it. So now I know it's assigned to me. I can put in a due date. You might not necessarily want to have the due date be the end of the sprint. You might want to have it earlier so you can actually build it and test it, integrated it with the rest of the code. Then we have something like enemy ships. Okay, so now I've done the player ships, all of these tasks, all of them have gone through concept in development, testing, reviewing, and completion, right? So I'm going to move all these now over to completion because my 2 weeks are over. I play tested it, iterated on it. Everything looks great. It's ready to ship, right? I'm moving this all over here. Let me organize this by epic. And these are all the stories behind it. You might want to add story here. And you could say epic ship. You could do it that way, or you could do epic ship story ship sprite. Like you can have it many different ways, but I'm just trying to do this real quick to show you different ways you could do it. Let's take a look. I'm now, okay, so now, hey, we are in, oh, come on, let me move all this stuff over. We're now in sprint number 2, right? Okay, our epic is enemy ships, right? That's our epic, right? However, there's going to be a lot of enemy ships, a lot, right? So we don't necessarily want to just take all of it because there's no way we can do all the enemy ships in 2 weeks. So let's just focus on 2 ships for this sprint, right? So I'm just going to, instead of moving over the epic, I'm just going to say enemy ship 1. I'm going to say epic, enemy ships, and then story enemy ship 1. And then we'll do another one. Actually, it's a way to make this even easier for you so you don't have to rewrite all that stuff is duplicate it. So let's see about duplicating it. So let's copy this. Whoops, I don't need to copy the whole list. I just need to copy this one card. Ah, I thought you could copy these. Maybe I am wrong. Guess I am wrong. Okay, so we'll just do another one here. Epic enemy ships story enemy ship 2, right? So let's just focus on those 2 for our sprint, because if we have more time, great, make more, but otherwise, all right, we at least have 2, right? We have a game with just 2, and then we might reprioritize this epic after the sprint's completed to go, you know what, we want to get more these other things down first. You might not want to put it at the bottom. Maybe it's still more important than background to have 3 or 4 enemies, but now we know before we do that, we want to work on missiles, we want to work on sound effects, we want to work on UI, we want to work on music. Then we'll look at making more enemy ships. Okay, this was a fast review of how you break down your game into ideas, how you break those features that are epics, creating stories from those epics, which you're not going to do until you're in production or actually in your sprint planning meeting, which is the beginning of your sprint. You plan out what your sprint will be, and that's where you figure out what your stories will be. Then we talked about what a backlog is. I recommended Trello. You can use an Excel spreadsheet. A lot of people do that as well. But we want you to share this in your presentation. So you can take a screenshot of this and include it in your PowerPoint. That would be fine. When you're actually submitting the deliverables, if you are using a Trello board, you can export it as a PDF, just hit, print it out as though it was a PDF, or you can actually include it as a link in your documentation that you're sending to us and share your Trello board with us. So Trello is a very easy tool to use. It's very intuitive. There's lots of instructions you can find online. If you run into any problems, please contact me. Please let me tag me on Discord, and I will do my best to help you out. I know this is coming a little late, but we wanted to get this information over to you. But backlogs, if you Google backlogs, you're going to see the same information out there. So, all right, thank you very much, and I look forward to seeing your projects. Bye-bye.